very exciting conversation with Janneke Parrish, one of the founders of Apple Together and the author of Tech Workers Guide to Unions. And I just want to say before we jump into the conversation that I'm one of those people who saw that campaign, the Apple Together campaign from a distance, and was not only excited, but just amazed that workers were able to pull off launching a campaign against a multinational corporation with billions and billions of dollars. I think it takes a lot of guts. I think it takes a lot of intelligence to even conceive of how to do something like that. So this conversation is going to be really great. So Janneke, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited to be here. So thank you.
Of course, thank you for taking time to have this conversation with us. And of course, a little later, we're going to talk about your book and see what folks can gather from that book, because I feel like it's going to be very helpful for other people who are going to follow in your footsteps. Well, let's start off with a very simple question. Why did you decide to form a union with Apple Together?
Yeah, so you say it's a simple question, but I think the process of deciding to unionize is never a simple decision, not for anybody involved. And certainly for you, since you're familiar with the steps of forming a union, there's very little that's simple about it, except for what lies at the very emotional core of a union. My and my colleagues' decision to form a union came out of our conversations with Apple leadership and our increasing awareness of what reality was for Apple workers. For my part, before I became involved with Apple Together, I had been working at Apple for 5 years as a full-time worker, and then another 9 months as a contract worker. And throughout that time, I'd seen a lot of things in the Apple ecosystem that didn't strike me as right. There was, for instance, the treatment of TBC workers. There was the treatment of workers who weren't in the California offices, a lot of different things. But it wasn't until the COVID pandemic that I and my colleagues had the resources to actually start putting the dots together to recognize that none of our experiences were happening in isolation. Apple is a very siloed culture. It's a culture that asks you to stay quiet, to stay secret, and to not speak to those who aren't immediately working on the same thing you are. Which means that when something happens in Apple, when there's a condition there or something happens, people aren't aware of it. What happens instead is that everything gets brushed under the rug. With the COVID pandemic, all of us were forced to move online. We were forced to, instead of meeting and chattering in person, to be able to move to online chat platforms like Slack. What that did was connect me with not only my colleagues in Austin, but also my colleagues around the world. It allowed me to connect with people whose experiences I never would have seen otherwise, and they, in turn, were able to connect with me. And I came to realize that the experience that I had had at Apple, the experience of feeling marginalized and sometimes brushed under the rug, was not an isolated one. Instead, it was normal. It was fairly normalized, especially for traditionally discriminated groups. There was a culture of not listening to us and marginalizing us. In response, I and some of my colleagues decided that we would start trying to take action. We would come together and try to change what we had seen and what was problematic. And that came down two forking paths. On the one hand, there were people like me who, when Apple announced that everybody needed to come back to the office, looked at that and realized that our working conditions were significantly better when we were working remote. And so we came together and we started petitioning Apple leadership to allow us to continue working remote, or to at least allow each of the individual managers of individual teams to make their own decision about what worked best for their team. We wrote an open letter to Apple leadership that received a very condescending and dismissive response, which was frankly very galvanizing for our movement. We now knew that no matter what we did, Apple leadership was not on our side. Apple leadership would not be interested in having a dialogue. This was, in fact, a dictatorship, which sounds very trite to say, but that was the reality we came to learn, and it was a harsh reality. We continued to write letters, we made a video, we did everything we could to petition leadership, but there was no meaningful feedback and no meaningful dialogue. And so we started looking at other avenues in order to pursue remote work. On the other hand, my colleague Cher Scarlett was pursuing her own avenue of pay equity, where she had discovered that there was a significant pay gap between the pay and opportunities presented to women and those presented to men. In my department, for instance, that equated to a 12% pay gap between men and women. Indeed, her research was really compelling, and there is currently a class action lawsuit that's been filed, and I'm happy to send you the link to find out more about that, regarding the pay discrepancy between men and women at Apple. She had a similar response that we had of being dismissed by Apple leadership, of being dismissed by HR, and so we ended up combining our forces and coming together to essentially galvanize the workplace and point out these inequities, to point out why remote work mattered, how dismissive Apple leadership was being of our concerns, and the gap between what Apple publicly presented itself as and the reality for the thousands of workers on the ground. This, in turn, sparked a little bit of an internal revolution. I know there was quite a bit that made it out into the news, but the reality within Apple was even more astounding. As I said, Apple has a very siloed culture. It's a very hermit corporation. We don't talk very much to each other or publicly. But suddenly, with Cher's work and with my work and with the work of our colleagues, we were starting dialogues at this company. There were each of the large chat rooms was filled with people discussing everything that we brought up. Each new news article became a flashpoint for something to discuss. It became this movement, this revolution within the company as well. And it was an incredible thing to see all these people from around the world sharing their experiences and coming together around the idea that we all deserved a better workplace. And this culminated in a town hall chat that Tim Cook held with questions submitted by workers as well. And while some of them were the usual fluffy things you expect of a meeting of those sorts, some were much more hard-hitting, such as the future of remote work, such as pay equity. And Tim Cook's responses, much like the responses we had gotten previously, were very dismissive, very condescending. Cher and I made the decision, along once again with our colleagues, to start going public with the stories that we had received about why remote work mattered to people, about what working at Apple was like. We started releasing these publicly under the hashtag Apple2. And those Apple2 digests are still readable, they're still visible, people are welcome to peruse them. We received hundreds of these stories. And as we shared them, we found that we received more and more pushback, culminating in me losing my job and Cher also being forced out of the company. But when I lost my job, what we found was that rather than what I think Apple had intended of having a chilling effect on organizing, it was the opposite. The day that Apple fired me, my firing made national news headlines around the country and around the world. I have screenshots of news articles about me in Taiwan, in Europe, around the world. It's a little astounding. But the day that happened, membership in our Discord server exploded to the point where we now have over 1,000 members in this Discord server, which is incredible. Apple Together has at this point become one of the largest solidarity unions in the tech industry, and what we have done with that membership, what we have done with the solidarity that we express, has been phenomenal. We have managed to push for pay increases for retail workers. We have improved the dialogue and the conversation around remote work. While Apple famously and notoriously is not a remote work friendly company, I believe that the dialogue we started and the conversation we started has led to Apple at least having a hybrid workplace, if not full remote. We have marched in solidarity with our colleagues in Australia and France and Sweden around the world, which was unthinkable prior to the founding of Apple Together. Multiple Apple retail stores at this point have either gone through successful union campaigns or are in the process of going through them. And again, it's because of the solidarity that we're able to create through Apple Together. And it's incredible. When we started Apple Together, I don't think this was what any of us had in mind. I don't think this is what any of us expected. But we are now in a position where workers are taking on one of the world's largest companies and winning. And it's a phenomenal feeling. And I'm very proud of everybody involved in the movement.
Wow, what an amazing, amazing story. A few questions actually came up to me while you were talking. What do you mean when you say solidarity union?
Yeah. Yeah, so it's a really great question. So I think when we think about unions, you often think about the traditional model of a union, and that's where all the workers are in one block, and everybody needs to file cards and file a petition with the NLRB to hold an election. There's an election, and then once everybody approves the union, then you have a formal contract. That's what I think of as a traditional union. But the reality of unionizing in the tech industry is that this traditional model doesn't work, not every time and not for every company, especially in the case of massive companies like Apple. As an example, Apple has, I think, 120,000 employees. And while it's admittedly a little funny to imagine everybody going up to the ballot box to vote, it's not feasible. Even for the US workers, it's not feasible. Even for one campus in the US to do this. I worked in Austin, and there we had, I believe, 6 or 7,000 workers. Imagining something like that unionizing in a traditional union drive, it's not really feasible. So within the tech industry, there are a few other ways of addressing this. There are a few other ways of forming unions that still express that worker power, just without that traditional model. And I explore some of them in my book, but a solidarity union is one of them. We essentially don't have a contract. We didn't have an election. We don't claim to represent the majority of workers. Realistically, we can't. But what we do claim to represent is workers' interests. And we claim to be able to help workers express that interest and express solidarity with one another. We are there to support workers when something happens. So, for instance, we have, again, supported our retail colleagues in unionizing their stores by providing access to resources, support, and funding as well. We also organize actions, and again, we do that internationally as well, so we're not just limited to the United States. But Apple, I don't think, acknowledges us as a union per se, but with our very vocal group, we're still able to affect change, and we're still able to make things happen within the company. We just have no guarantee that this will happen. But we also have a lot more flexibility. As I said, we're able to support our retail colleagues, even though that I think would not be as effective in a traditional union. We are able to work internationally with our colleagues around the world, and we are able to take actions that a traditional union may not actually be able to take.
That's a very, very novel approach to something that's been challenging the labor movement for a long time. There's a lot of industries where the pure scale, is a challenge that, it will require multiple unions collaborating to get a serious run at organizing all the workers in the company. Amazon, for example, the Amazon labor union just affiliated with Teamsters just the other day, which is probably a conversation for another day, but very interesting nonetheless. And correct me if I'm wrong, they were in the news similar in the time frame that you all were, or actually you were pre-Amazon labor union, right?
And so some of the warehouses were unionizing at the same time as us. It's been vacillating over who's in the news at any given time.
Okay. Well, regardless, it's all part of very, very interesting and exciting
Yes.
stuff, right?
Yeah.
And so this is a question for folks who are watching this, and if they've gotten to this point, they're like plugged in. And oh, finally, I get to hear the details. So give us some of the nitty gritty. Like, how did you start the campaign? Was it you and a coworker sitting in a cubicle or in the store, and you're literally right there, and you're like, hey, what if we organize ourselves? Or was it that you saw something online that sparked you? What got you started?
Yeah, so I'll be completely honest. I've never met any of my fellow organizers in real life. I've met them. I've chatted with everybody online. We've met virtually many, many times.
That's
Yeah,
incredible.
yeah. No, we've met virtually many, many times, but I've never met any of them in person. And indeed, for the core group, I'm not sure any of them have met each other either. We have done this mostly online, and part of that is I recognize that in traditional organizing, that's not necessarily the best model. But for us, we have our organizers in California, Washington. I was in Texas. We have organizers in Japan. We are, again, around the world. By not limiting ourselves to in-person conversations or just talking to the colleague next to me, we're able to create a much more diverse body of organizers and a much more diverse group of leaders who better represent the whole of this, frankly, massive company. And that again started in these chat rooms that became available to us when COVID hit. When COVID hit, Apple as a company was migrating its workers onto the chat platform Slack. And within Slack, there were obviously the channels for each individual team to have their team discussions, but then there were also general channels, like a channel about news about Apple, a channel for engineers, a channel all about dogs, those sorts of channels.
I like
And
that channel. I like the dog channel.
I was also a big fan. One of the channels that came up was the remote work advocacy Slack channel, where we just discussed what do we like about remote work. It started as a basically remote work survival channel of understanding, okay, here's how I'm adjusting to remote work, here are my suggestions and productivity tips. But then, as I said, it evolved into an advocacy channel. And that's where many of us met each other. It was that, and it was the women engineering channels. Women in software engineering is the actual name. That we just we just collected and met each other there, discussing common topics, and then saying, "Hey, we should discuss this in a more private forum," which is where we formed a Discord server, and that's what we now call home. I at no point really felt limited by the lack of physical connection. Indeed, again, I think that being able to meet online creates a lot of accessibility that otherwise we would never have. It does limit how much you can have that sort of election model, but at the same time, again, we're able to better represent the diversity of the company and connect with workers I never would have met otherwise.
Absolutely. And you sort of answered something I was going to ask you, which is, within the realms of safety that you can tell me, because, who knows, a company might be watching this at some point.
I have no doubt. I have no doubt.
Right? What were, and this is for folks who are, hoping to organize themselves, what were some helpful forms of technology that you all would ever use? So I heard Discord, I heard Slack. Anything else that you all like?
Yeah, so the first tip I'll give to anybody who is considering this and is concerned about security is remember that your work device is not a safe device. And that is especially true if you work for a very large tech company who owns that device. You should assume that anything you put on your work device, the company will be able to access at some point, whether you know it or not. Whether that's actually true for your company, just treat it as if it is. To that end, then, what we tended to do was make connections via our company Slack. So, for instance, if I saw that Jim was saying something interesting, I'd say, "Hi, Jim. That's a super interesting comment you made. I'd love to discuss it with you further. Would you be interested in texting with me?" And then I would give my personal phone number and we would have a text that way. And then if Jim still seemed amenable, we would have a video chat. Again, that's harder to record. It's harder to send on to somebody who can't be trusted. And then if Jim was still amenable, Jim could get invited into the private Discord server we had set up. For that private Discord server, we obviously have security to make sure that we're not letting in managers or HR or other people we would rather not let in. I'll leave our security measures up to the imagination, other than to say that they have definitely been sufficient so far. But those are ways to still organize online and to organize remotely. It's thinking a little bit creatively and remembering to use your personal device rather than your company device.
That's fantastic, fantastic advice. There have been some rulings recently from the National Labor Relations Board about company devices and whether the information belongs to you. And we will be sending out some information about that. But yeah, a general rule of thumb is if it's the company's device, it's not your data, it's not your information, it belongs to the company. So be aware that workers who are watching this. There's something that I wanted to ask about the sort of culture of Apple. A lot of times Americans, I don't want to say this is just Americans, but in the American context, we tend to have a emotional connection to brands, right? So,
Yes.
right. Think about Jordans. Kids love Jordans, and they wait in line for hours for them. Or, what's another good brand to use as an example? It could be
Apple.
Apple, right? So Apple, you know, people will always buy the new iPhone every time it comes out, right? And they've got this like, right. So in a way, I think this is just my like junior analysis that when you were able to get this thing up and running and it hit the media, it kind of popped that bubble a little bit
Yes.
where people are like, oh, wait, it's not the perfect company. I mean, everybody's got this emotional connection to Steve Jobs as a genius. It's some Elon Musk, that's the one I was thinking of. It's another Tesla. Everybody has this emotional connection. So Apple is one of those companies where because they have overseas operations, they have parts that come from all over the world, allegedly African minds and all these different things. It's a company that sort of has a mixed reputation. So my question for you is, what was the level of awareness that you all had of that as workers? And to what degree did that play into your decision to organize? So like knowing that it has mixed labor practices and that the environment that you all are working in isn't exactly in line with the branding that is put out on the web.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really, really interesting question, and it's a pretty fantastic one because it speaks to one of the barriers we faced when organizing. Again, I mentioned that Apple is very siloed and hermited, but at the same time, it's a FANG company. It's one of those companies that people spend their whole tech life, their whole tech careers trying to get into because it's one of those that has the reputation of paying well, of being secure, of being a good place to work. And with that comes a certain degree of loyalty on the part of workers, where we definitely encountered people who were diehard for Apple. They would defend Apple with their dying breath, and were very very much against what we were doing because they saw us as disloyal or in some way trying to tear down the company or destroy its reputation. What it didn't necessarily matter that everything we said was true, that everything that we were talking about was a valid critique, and that we were framing it within the context of we would like to improve the place where we are working. There were some people that we just could not convince, and who were very much against us because we were speaking up. Similarly, when our work started going public, when our campaign started going public, we ran into the same issues where with certain companies, I think there's a public awareness that they're not necessarily the best companies to work for, with Amazon springing to mind. But with Apple, we got a fair amount of backlash from the public saying, oh, these entitled six-figure engineers, these entitled tech people, how dare they think they deserve a union? When the reality is that many of us within the organizing campaign were not making six figures. Many of us were not living in California or working in that giant loop building. And the reality is that we were organizing because we wanted to improve our workplace for everybody. What we learned was that there are haters out there. There are people who will try and tear you down, but we learned first to address them with kindness. So for our colleagues inside Apple, we always addressed them with kindness. We always said, hey, I see you feel that way. We are not in any way trying to tear down your job or tear down this company. We are trying to make this the best it can be for you and for me. But also to recognize when to engage with public perception and when not to engage. And again, to address everybody with kindness and love.
I think that's a great organizer's approach. And now I hear a lot of really great organizing techniques from you. Respect to that. And just for elucidation, Bang, Facebook, Facebook, Apple, Amazon. What's the N?
Netflix.
Netflix. Oh, okay. And then Google.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. So this is the collection of multi-billion-dollar companies that make up the tech sector, right?
Yes. And I'll grant you at the moment that FANG acronym is probably not in a happy place after all the tech layoffs, but
That's exactly, you read my
yeah.
mind. That's exactly where I was going with it, where they're firing 10, 20% of their company or their workforce. And they went from, minimum 150,000 to $300,000 salaries and, juice bars and, cold brew coffees to, AI has really shaken up the sector. And we're going to do a lot of like kind of in-depth on that, but I'm curious if you have any thoughts about that because that space has gone through a lot of changes since you first started organizing. Has that
Yeah.
affected your organizing, anything like that?
Absolutely. So you mentioned something in the last question that I wanted to come back to that I think does a really good job of answering this question as well, and that's that public perception of Apple. Where of the FANG companies, I think Apple probably has one of the best reputations in that group. It certainly has a very good public perception of it. They've poured money into PR and it's paying off for them. But our campaign did something to mar that, but I think it's still worth calling out that I think that what we did was honestly one of the more effective ways to get to Apple was to mar that public image. It's worth calling out that Apple is one of those companies that has not made headlines for layoffs, but that's because they've done it so quietly. They've done it so effectively that they haven't made headlines. It's not that they're not doing layoffs, it's that they are very good at playing that PR game. So for us specifically, we learned to play that game as well. And we keep track of the layoffs that are going on within Apple. When someone loses their job, or when somebody knows a teammate or a colleague or a team down the hallway who lost their job, we know about it. We keep track of it, and we know that there have been thousands of jobs lost at Apple. And we know that this has an effect on organizing throughout the tech industry. I personally have friends who have been searching for a job for the last year, and they are friends who, at their previous role, were looking at organizing or had already started campaigns and then lost their jobs, and it has a chilling effect. It has a chilling effect on the one hand because people don't want to lose their jobs. They know how hard it is to get another one, and so they are concerned about what happens if they do organize. But it also has a chilling effect in the sense that it's removing workers from the companies where organizing is happening. It's removing those organizers and not giving them a way to continue to connect with that company, or also removing the energy and the impetus to continue to organize at that company. But it also highlights how badly unions are actually needed in the tech industry. When we have no protection against the incursion of AI into our work, when we have no protection on our intellectual abilities and our talents, when we have no real recourse when there are mass layoffs at Twitter or any of these other large companies, it highlights how much a union is actually needed. And I think that's what's really interesting, is that we are still seeing organizing within the tech industry. I believe I saw an article recently about workers at Tesla organizing, and workers at Tesla having a new lawsuit filed against Elon Musk. It's another example of workers realizing that the response to mass layoffs, the response to bosses not respecting their humanity, is not to lay down and be afraid and have that chilling effect and be effective. It is to organize, it is to fight back, and it is to protect each other and stand in solidarity with one another.
Absolutely. That's so well put. A lot of what you noted about growing your campaign and some of the challenges there are reflective of what we experienced at Sierra Club. Obviously it's a nonprofit organization, so the challenges are a bit different. But there's always sort of a through thread or through line, I would say, of commonality with worker struggle. Is there anything that you would identify was sort of the biggest challenge that you had to overcome, besides sort of the brand thing, being remote is difficult, dealing with, company power and wealth is difficult. Anything else that you would add to that?
Yeah, I think so again, I touched on it briefly, but there is that sense of a perception of who unions are for. There is that sense of, okay, we are all well-paid engineers, why do we need a union? And that is a difficult thing to overcome. But again, we found that by that first, a lot of Apple workers are very empathetic. We do care about each other. And so explaining, hey, this is the experience of somebody working in Apple Care, or this is the experience of somebody working in a store, we found that that was very effective at getting people to care and express solidarity with one another. There's also the reframing of, okay, our job security, of remote work, of pay equity, of these sorts of things that appeal to every worker, regardless of their income, regardless of what their job title actually is. Everybody wants to make sure they're getting paid fairly for their work. Everybody wants to make sure they have job security. In reframing what the union was going to focus on and taking it away from what people traditionally think of as a union and reframing it into, this is what we need at Apple. This is what we need to make sure our jobs are as good as they can be, so we can make the best products we can and have the experience that's promised on the Apple employment website. By reframing it, we were able to get a lot more support from people who otherwise might never have supported a union. That said, one of the biggest challenges we did still face was that this is a very large company with very deep pockets who have a lot of experience with union busting. Ours was not the first union attempted at Apple. There had been others before. They had all been busted in their own ways. But I think we were effective because we planned, we prepared, we knew how to fight back. I mentioned PR and how Apple has a phenomenal PR engine. We did our best to do the same. We did our best to manipulate those levers of power in a way that we would have as loud a voice as possible and get as much attention and focus as possible, and thereby force the company to act and to respond, which is exactly what happened. Those news articles, the Washington Post profile on Cher, the news articles in NPR and The Guardian, all of those publications, they weren't accidents. We did our best to make sure that Apple saw us, Apple heard us, and Apple was forced to listen to workers for the first time.
That's awesome. And, one of the things that I say a lot when I do speaking engagements is, companies spend an incredible amount of resources resisting unionization. Sometimes, you could be arguing for, like, let's say a 5% increase in wages across the board, but they'll say no to that. They'll spend $100 million on lawyers to fight the unionization effort, right? And, we've started working with some, employers and trying to say, hey, like, let's look at the bottom line here and think about, would it be more advantageous to you to fight this campaign or to accept it? And then think about the stability you get from a unionized workforce, about how, you get wage increases over the years, but the amount that you would spend on retraining employees by constantly cycling through, because it's not a family sustaining wage paying job, from constantly having to deal with conflicts that could be solved by a labor management committee. There's a lot of advantages to being a union employer that, maybe union employers aren't vocal about because it's not like, in fashion to do so. But my hope is that one day a lot of these companies will realize that it's actually not that bad, and that you get, stability in terms of the amount of money you have to even pay to workers, because you're not always caught in that big layoff cycle. But I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I definitely agree with all of that, that I think there is a lot of effectiveness in framing things in a way that make managers happy. It seems a little counter to the theory of unions. Unions are all about worker power, they're about worker solidarity and about sort of reclaiming the power from managers. But it is easier to reclaim power from somebody who is willing to share it than it is to take it by force. And so reframing a union into a positive for the company is absolutely beneficial. That's one thing that we also pursued. We pursued using the sort of mechanisms of capitalism and the mechanisms of shareholder capitalism as a way to further our union. One project that we have that we are very proud of because it's been very effective is shareholder resolutions. We have worked with several large capital firms to push forward shareholder resolutions that are ours, essentially. In 2021, that was working with Nia Capital to push forward and successfully pass a shareholder resolution, essentially calling for pay equity and an investigation and action into pay equity at Apple. That wouldn't have happened without us, and we're super, super proud of that. But at the same time, it is also using the mechanisms of capitalist power in a way that benefits the worker. And I think when we think about unions in the 21st century, when we think about the power that workers have, it's also things like that. It's in using the mechanisms that exist to benefit us rather than having them used as tools of oppression.
Absolutely. Well put. I was asking about the shareholder work because that's actually some of the most exciting things that I think unions do. Without going too deep into the strategy, just quickly, I've heard that sometimes unions will buy just a little bit of the share of ownership of a company's stock so that they have the ability to join those shareholder meetings and sort of voice their grievances. Is that right? Is that what you all have done?
So what we did is Apple rewards its workers through stocks. So if you do a good job each year, you're given some stocks, and those stocks have voting rights. In addition, Apple also has an employee stock purchase plan where you can take a section of your paycheck and invest it back into Apple stock. So we essentially pooled our stock into one large vote and then collaborated with Nia Capital to get more votes. to push our shareholder resolutions forward. Our 2022 resolutions, we did all on our own, again, through pooling our stock and saying we are going to be one vote here. It wasn't that the union itself bought these shares, it was us, each of us individually deciding we can do this, we are going to do this, we believe in each other.
That is really exciting as a strategy. And I mean, there's other groups that I don't know what the Starbucks Workers Union strategy is, but that might be something that I believe they're doing something of a similar nature. But maybe in the next 5 to 10 years, we could see multiple groups of workers across these companies coming together in the same way that the companies do, and figuring out how to have a shared voice. That's a good vision for the future. So I have a couple more questions here before we wrap. What would you like to say to other Apple workers or workers from other companies within FANG or other companies who want to unionize? I mean, this whole conversation has been directed at those folks, but anything in particular you want to leave them?
Yeah, so I will say I don't think unionizing in the tech industry is solely happening at the big companies. Most of the tech industry, I think, is smaller companies. It's startup or mid-sized companies. It's companies for whom maybe that traditional model does make more sense, but also it's companies who are within an ecosystem that is dominated by FANG, that is dominated by Microsoft and these giant conglomerates. So there is always that sense of fear of, okay, if I do this, I'm blacklisting myself from the industry, and it's a valid fear. But the main recommendation I would have is that a union, every worker benefits from a union. Everybody benefits from being in a union. Everybody benefits from being able to have a say in their workplace. And for the tech industry, especially, many of us are in the industry because we want to make the world better, because we want to improve the world. We want to build something that is meaningful, that makes a meaningful difference, and that builds the world we want to live in. What we see, though, is that power has shifted from the workers and to these dreamers to the hands of large corporations. It has shifted to the hands of profit. By unionizing, by making our voices heard, we take back our future. We take back the future not only of our own jobs, not only of the companies we work for and the companies we care about, we take back the future of, frankly, the world. The world is built on technology. The world is shaped and changed by the technologies we build. It's time that we built technology that was human-centric, that was worker-centric, that kept our talent and our labor and our energy in mind. And it's through unions that we do that. It is unions that allow us to build the future that we want to build. We can't leave that in the hands of big tech anymore.
Extremely well put. It's so frustrating to hear folks who have only ever worked in big tech sort of making decisions for the future of work for everybody else, and thinking that tech is the way to fix every problem, which we know it can be a part of the solution, but it's very, very seldom the only solution.
And that's why I found your question about AI so interesting, because it is sort of tech fighting itself at this point. We need, again, thinking about AI as one example, we need to build AI that is worker-centric, that is human-centric. And again, we do that by making sure workers' voices are at the table.
Absolutely. Okay, and as a close-up question here, I'm very excited to hear about this. This is something I'm actually going to be purchasing a copy myself. Tell us about your book, Tech Workers Guide to Unions.
Yes, I wrote a book. This is my book. It's called The Tech Workers Guide to Unions, and it's got a lovely red cover. And I wrote this book basically as a guide. It's everything I wish I had known when I started as an organizer. It includes advice for getting started. It includes one of the very first chapters is, okay, so if you are afraid to do this, I get that, and here's some advice for what to do and how to prepare yourself. But what I really love about it is that it's not just me talking about my experience. I interviewed dozens of organizers from throughout the industry to get a broader, bigger, more diverse picture of what organizing in the tech industry actually looks like, and how it varies from small companies to large companies and everything in between. I talked to workers like Clarissa Redwine to get a sense of the evolution and development of organizing as well, and what workers can do in the future. It's a book that, I wrote it in the sense of these are things I wish I had known, but I think of it as essentially a collection of what everybody has learned as part of organizing in this community. What I think I've learned more than anything, though, is that it's a very welcoming community. It's a very open and loving community. So if you are interested in organizing, by all means, reach out to me, reach out to any of the organizers in the book. We are happy to help, and we are happy to offer whatever support we can to organize and to build that better tech future together.
Awesome. And we will put a link to that book in the information section here on YouTube, and also in whatever form of social media you're on. The link will be there, because this is a really good read from what I've seen. And yeah, maybe we'll have you back on to dig into the principles of the book and break it down. Would that be?
I'd love to.
Okay, I'm sure people would love that. And one more thing I'll add here: shout out to Clarissa Redwine, one of the founders of Kickstarter, somebody who we actually are going to have on the program, thanks to Janneke. And I think it's going to be a really great conversation as well.
I'm glad to
Well,
hear
I'll
it.
let you give us the last word here. This has been a really great conversation, the first of many similar conversations. You've already given us sort of some things to think about and to go with into the future, but give us a last word to close us out here.
Yeah, the last word I can think is that a labor union is not a labor union starts with just one inspiration. It starts with one person using their voice to say, I think we can do better. I think we can make a difference. Don't be afraid to be that voice. Don't be afraid to have that conversation. The employment world is a scary, scary place, but it only gets better if we work together and if we work in solidarity with one another and take that chance and say, I think we can do better.